Ugh, no, I have not done.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome.
Oh, I see.
Let us know where you're tuning in from. Use the chat and tell us where you're logging in from. Baltimore. South of Seattle. I love it. I'm in Seattle. Naomi's in Seattle. Caroline is actually in Edinburgh. So representing all over the place. Lots of people tuning in from Seattle, from Georgia in the US. Ah, thank you, Jane. Sammamish. This is great. We'll let a few more people get logged in and then we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. 10 a.m. here in Seattle. Hello from Istanbul. Welcome. Yes, I'm excited too. All right, so that looks like we've kind of stabilized here for a bit. So I'm going to go ahead and get started and others will join in. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I'm Laura Hamilton. I have a cookbook shop here in Seattle that's called Book Larder. We are in the Fremont neighborhood of Seattle, and we have a big kitchen in our space where we typically do cooking classes and author talks. And in the current circumstances, we have taken that part of our business to Zoom. And one of the great things about that is that it has allowed us to have people from all over the world join us for these events and for us to bring together conversations with authors and interviewers in different parts of the world. So we will look at that at the upside of this situation as it opens up sort of new opportunities for us. And I'm so glad that you've decided to join us today. Thank you for that. We are delighted to welcome Caroline Eden to the Zoom kitchen, so to speak, today. Caroline is a journalist and travel writer and the author of this fantastic book, Red Sands. She will be in conversation with Naomi Tomky, who is a Seattle-based writer about food and travel as well, and the author of her own book, which came out just a year ago, called Pacific Northwest Seafood Cookbook. They are going to talk about Red Sands, Central Asia, travel, cooking, all those things, and of course, leave time for questions as well. So if you could please use the Q&A button in Zoom to ask questions. You can use the chat to talk to each other, but use the Q&A, please, for your questions. We will get to as many of those as we can. The book, of course, is available for purchase at our website, booklarder.com. And you can support this talk and just support our independent bookstore by buying it from us if you are so inclined. So I am going to turn things over now to Caroline and Naomi.
Hi, thanks so much, Laura and Caroline. It's great to have you. Thanks so much for coming out. Coming out? I don't know, whatever it is we do. Coming
Thanks
on.
for having me.
So I loved Red Sands in that it gave such an interesting, just a full view of not just the food, but how you interacted with everybody as you traveled. And it's just amazing to see how much else goes into eating and food besides just the recipes. So one of the first things I wanted to ask is, if you're introducing that culture to someone else, what's the first meal that you're going to bring someone landing in Central Asia, whichever city or town you choose? Where are you going to bring them to eat to introduce them to that food?
Oh, I like this question. So if we imagine a generic Central Asian city, it could be Tashkent in Uzbekistan, it could be Almaty in Kazakhstan, or Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan. They're all going to have chaikhanas, traditional tea houses, which are now kind of more like cafes or canteen settings. And the menus are going to be quite typical if they're a traditional Central Asian restaurant. and they're definitely going to have samsa on the menu. This is a pastry turnover with a filling, maybe lamb, maybe pumpkin, maybe potato. So nothing too complicated or fancy, absolutely delicious, flaky, hot out the oven, triangle, bit like a samosa, Indian samosa with different filling, sprinkled with some nigella seeds probably on the top. So we'd start with those. We definitely have a tomato salad on the side, maybe with some purple basil. And then I think I'd go slightly off piece and not suggest plov. We'll maybe save that to discuss later. I'd go with lagman. Lagman is my favorite Central Asian dish. It's a noodle dish. It's a Uyghur dish. So it's from China, from the Turkic Muslim community there. They introduced this dish to Central Asia, and it's delicious. It's noodles topped with a very mild stew, normally with lamb. And very mild spicing, maybe some celery, maybe some sort of red peppers, really filling, really delicious, quite simple, but very, very nice. We'd have that. We'd definitely have it with tea, probably with green tea out of the little handleless cups called pialas, and we'd have the teapot on the table there. So that's how we'd start.
I love it. I love lagman. I've only had it, the Chinese version from Xinjiang. Does it differ a lot between Xinjiang and Central Asia, or between the different cultures in Central Asia?
The main difference is you can have guru lagman or you can have boso lagman. And the only difference is, I think it's, I don't want to get this wrong, guru lagman comes separately. So you'd get the noodles hand pulled, which is a lovely thing because they're all slightly different shape and slightly different widths. You'd have the noodles, and then your server would put the meat, vegetables on the top at the table. Bosu lagman is chopped, the noodles will be chopped, and it will all come as one dish. That's the main variation I've seen on my travels. I had it recently with a lot of celery in it, which I really liked, which I hadn't had before.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, so I think that conversation about how this is a Chinese food that's common in Central Asia is actually a great segue into one of the most interesting things about the region, which is how much it's a crossroads. You really gave it a framing as a crossroads in time, in terms of that it's such a changing region right now. But you also are at the intersection of continents and all the different religions that you cover. You talk about the Jews of Bukhara, and also you spend time in mosques, and you celebrate Easter. So what, and then there's the Korean food, which I find one of the most interesting aspects of the whole thing. How do you choose which dishes and cultures you're representing, and how to do that as you're choosing for the book?
I think it's whatever is interesting. And I know that sounds like a basic thing to say, but the recipes have to express the journey in some way. Otherwise, it's endless. We could include lots of different things. So I think for me, the recipes are like maps. They lead you somewhere. They're another way of telling the story. They're a way of expressing the journey. So they have to have a reason to be included. So, and it was the same with my last book, Black Sea. I tried to choose recipes only if they were relevant to the story, because I feel it's one thing to write a cookbook, but if you're writing a lot of prose, I think the recipes have to make sense. They have to have a reason for being in there. So it's really, if they catch the feel of the place, or there's a human story I'm particularly interested in, usually a human story to be told, then I'll include a recipe that's relevant for that.
So I'm going to ask sort of a process nerdy question, because I was filled with curiosity about this. How do you choose? Do you just sort of go and travel and then afterwards look back and say, okay, this was interesting, that was interesting? Or do you have certain dishes that you're looking for? How do you plan? You covered basically 2 trips, your spring and your fall. Yeah. How did you plan for them? And was it different for the second half after you sat at home with this for a little while?
That's a good question. It was different in the second half. With Black Sea, I went and I saw what I could find, because I am not an expert on the Black Sea region. With Red Sands, I've been writing about Central Asia for over a decade, so I kind of knew where the stories were. Also, my photographer, who I've worked with on both books, is a Central Asianist, and my husband also, he was with me for little segments of the trip. So we kind of knew where we needed to go, but not always. I think it's a mixture. Sometimes it pays just to show up. I think the key is to have time. Obviously, this is a luxury, but I do reporting and my work is really out there, the writing that I do. So I spend a lot of time, you know, months in places and waiting. And I think eventually interesting things show up, but I do think you have to invest the time. So yeah, some things I definitely pinpointed. The obvious story is the world's biggest walnut forests in Kyrgyzstan.
Right.
I'd been there before. I hadn't been there for the harvest. I knew I wanted to return there for the harvest. The halva that they're making in the back of a mosque in Kokand, I knew about this. I hadn't been there before, so I made a beeline for that. But there were great surprises. Pavlodar in northern Kazakhstan, where I've got a recipe for a sour cream and peach cake, was totally unexpected. I knew it was very Russian in the north of Kazakhstan. I didn't expect it to be. It was like being in Siberia. I mean, yurt cafes look completely bizarre there because it is still extremely Russian. You know, they've got theatres dedicated to Chekhov, you know, restaurants named after his novels. It's very Russian. So that was a surprise. The surprises are great. I get more excited about those when I'm doing these research trips. But yeah, sometimes you get disappointments. It doesn't always work out.
And so are you reporting while you were researching the book, or like you were reporting stories as well, or were you just focused on the food?
So I write about Central Asia generally. So sometimes I might be doing a book review, or I might be doing something about art, or sometimes I do radio for the BBC. So it depends what I'm interested in. And I have to say also, because I've been interested in this region for such a long time, I have a great network of friends, which is obviously useful. And so often I spend time with them, and they sometimes say, oh, have you heard about this really cool restaurant, you know, 300 miles in that direction? And I'll be like, oh, I might do that. Yeah.
Awesome. It seems like a good way to travel. I'm pretty envious. Sorry, I'm like kid trying to get in. Okay. You mentioned with the Black Sea that you were kind of more exploring and that you didn't know it as well. But one of the things I found really interesting is that one is Black Sea. Obviously, it was all about places that border on a certain body of water. And this one was Red Sands, and it was all about the desert and the places that border on the desert. I would love to hear how that difference of being a water focused and a land focused, landlocked even culture showed up in the food and the experiences, and who the people were that you were talking to.
That's such a good question. Yeah. So I could probably do an hour just on this, so I'll try not to do that. The book begins on the Caspian Sea, but we're just there for a moment and then we travel inwards. And it's funny because the Caspian Sea is also lake shaped, a bit like the Black Sea, but we're just there for a moment. And then we travel inwards, and it's the Kizilkum Desert, the Red Sands Desert, does form the center of the book, but the book isn't just about the desert. Obviously, that wouldn't be so interesting. It goes way beyond the borders of this sort of sandy desert which spans Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. And I have to say, while that sounds very dry, it's also, the Kizilkum is bordered by two of Central Asia's most important rivers, the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya. And there's a lot of controversy about these if you look at the history of the Aral Sea and the way they've been drained and abused by Soviet developers. But they supply great irrigation channels for that region. And with those irrigation channels, you get fantastic fertile valleys. This is a region famous for its fruit, and rightly so. I think it's the best fruit in the world. So it sounds dry, but it isn't really. And those rivers are key. The other interesting thing with how it's different to Black Sea and looking at a sort of body of water is that the main ways that the landscape shapes the food in Central Asia is you have the people of the settled cities who've been on the Silk Road for hundreds and hundreds of years, the Uzbeks, the Tajiks, and some of the Turkmen. And then you've got the steppe lands of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and these are traditionally nomads. And so their food is meat and milk. And the settled people of Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and bits of Turkmenistan, their food is what you can buy in the bazaar and what you can cook on a stove as a settled person. So then you get great rice dishes and breads and lots of other different, more sort of complex dishes. So that's the key way how the landscape shapes it. The nice thing with the Black Sea is you have a coast and you follow the coast, and that's one nice linear journey. The problem with this book is I could have gone anywhere, and this is an enormous part of Asia. It's the heart of Asia. Just Kazakhstan is the 9th largest country in the world. And you know, you're in America, but if you're British, this is like hugely intimidating, massive land masses. So I had to pick carefully where to select and what to leave out. Sorry, that was slightly rambling.
No, that's okay. I'm curious in terms of the food. I mean, I'm assuming on the Black Sea, you're looking at seafood and fish to some extent. Is there much of trade inland from the waters, or is it fairly land focused?
You get quite a lot of trout from the rivers. Trout's quite popular. I
feel like this is a selfish question. I'm a seafood author.
Yeah, no, I know you are. No, it's a good question because no one's ever asked me this before. I suppose the most interesting story is the caviar trade around the Caspian. So this is the traditional homeland of the world's best caviar. It has been ransacked, completely abused, and now is on the red list. You can buy it illegally, but so you don't see very much of that. But yeah, caviar was traditionally the big industry up on the Caspian Sea. Iran, obviously, Azerbaijan, and Kazakhstan.
You could have gone anywhere. You mentioned you could go anywhere, but except for, was it Turkmenistan? You said that you didn't go to because of safety?
I could have gone to Turkmenistan, probably. But the problem with Turkmenistan is you can't really report there freely. And because I like to float around and take my time and speak to people and not worry too much about the questions I'm asking, it would have been difficult. You're supposed to have a guide outside of the capital, Ashgabat, as well, and I'm not really cool with that. So I didn't really want an organized guide, someone sort of, if you've traveled a lot in the former Soviet Union, you get quite paranoid about being followed. I'm quite serious, it is an issue. Yeah. And so, yeah, Turkmenistan, I think one day, perhaps, but not for this book. It's enough.
Have you spent time in Turkmenistan or?
No.
Yeah. So we have a question that's actually in the chat, but I wanted to ask it as well. So I'm going to bring it over to the Q&A. When you're traveling, are you speaking Russian to everybody, or is that you speak Russian and that's the main language you interact with, or?
I do speak some Russian. I'm not completely fluent. I'm not a linguist, but I do speak Russian. Quite a lot of people speak English nowadays if they're under 45. But yeah, Russian is still the most common language. The other languages tend to be Turkic, apart from in Tajikistan, which is more similar to Farsi. So if you speak Turkish, actually, I do not speak Turkish, but I spend quite a lot of time in Istanbul and I can hear similar words. The colors are the same, the word for water is the same. So I think Turkish speakers can definitely get by.
Nice. Yeah. And then there was another question that was in the Q&A that's actually similar to one that I was going to ask, which is that given Asia, and this is from James, given Central Asia's Silk Road heritage, I would have expected the cuisine of its countries to be richly and complexly spiced, but in my experience, that's not the case in contrast to, say, Indian food. Is there a historical or cultural reason for the relative sparing use of spices in the region?
That's a good question. It is very light on spicing. Cumin is the most popular one. It's just preference, I think. I mean, obviously under the Soviet Union, there's a lot of Russian food still served in all of these countries. That doesn't tend to be very heavily spiced. There's a hangover there. The Silk Road, obviously everything was coming through. Not everything, some things were going by water, obviously, eventually, but I don't know really. I mean, it's not, trying to think. I mean, chilies are used, obviously garlic's used, cumin, sometimes some paprika But yeah, if you go with any expectations of it being anything like South Asian food, you will be disappointed. There are parallels with Afghan food, because you're right, they're on the border. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure why. I suppose because it's not producing these things. It's not, these are things that were coming from elsewhere and passing through. They weren't actually being. I'm thinking of things like, I don't know, cinnamon and star anise. These were not things that were grown there. So not sure. Dill. I mean, herbs are used very heavily.
Right. So my somewhat related question that I'm going to tag on here was, Central Asia has not always enjoyed, let's just say, the most enthusiastic reception in outside of Central Asia, in terms of people being really interested in their food the way they are in, say, Chinese food, or even Turkish food. I would say, I think Middle Eastern food enjoys sort of a reputation as being really lovely and full of flavor, and Central Asian food does not. Why do you think that is, and how do you change people's minds on that?
Well, I have to say, from our point of view in the West, it looks like this. Russians love Central Asian food. So I don't want to say most, because I haven't traveled everywhere in Russia, but in many Russian cities, you will have an Uzbek restaurant. Even in the Baltics, actually, I was in the Baltics just before lockdown, and there are Uzbek restaurants. So we don't see it, but the Russians, a bit like with Georgian food, love Uzbek food. There's many reasons for this. It's partly because it was part of the Soviet Union. It's partly because, unfortunately, there have been a string of dictators who haven't made it particularly easy for foreign people to visit, to understand the cuisine there. So Islam Karimov in Uzbekistan has been dead for a couple of years now. And under him, it was not comfortable to travel in Uzbekistan. I mean, it was fine, but it wasn't, tourism certainly wasn't encouraged, and you were seen as a bit of a pest rather than as sort of, the people would make you extremely welcome, but on the borders, you would occasionally be made to feel unwelcome. So I think there's that. I think it's just not very sexy. It's not seen as, the flavors aren't very strong. I think people don't understand where these countries are. This is a huge problem still. I mean, it's amazing. People think the Caucasus is in Central Asia. I hear this all the time. And it's just a case of education. People, unfortunately, in the newspapers, it's normally small wars which are reported. It's not very much written about the food, but people who go there, it's very rare nowadays that people go there and come back and say the food is, was hard work. I think we might talk about this later. It has gotten easier. Now there's a little bit more of a foreign influence and more money, actually, since the fall of the Soviet Union. Yeah,
I mean, Georgia's definitely made the leap. Georgian food is super, I don't know what it's like in the UK, but here it's super trendy.
I don't think it's as big as it is in the US, but it's certainly popular. There are a few very good restaurants in London, for example.
No, Georgian food, I would say, at least all over the West Coast and the East Coast, I've seen Georgian restaurants, and
it's delicious.
Yeah, everybody's super into it.
But you can eat very good Georgian food in Central Asia now.
There you go.
in most cities, there will be a Georgian restaurant.
Yeah, I know. When I talk to people who've lived in Moscow, they say, "Oh, the Georgian restaurants are where you go for the great food there." Sort of like you were saying about Uzbek.
Yeah.
So I think, you talked about people go there and they change their minds. One of the things that I found really cool about the book is the way that it's structured around where you eat something, not just what you eat, but each essay was named after a place, whether that was a specific place or a kind of place like the dacha, the bathhouse, or the micro neighborhoods. What is the connection between place and food, and why did you decide that a book about food should be divided by place?
So in a cynical way, I have to say, you have to structure a book somehow. So you're either going to do it by season, or you're going to do it by theme, or just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So when I think of Central Asia, it's always the Soviet Islamic mix which I found most fascinating. because they're not easy bedfellows, but this is what Central Asia is. You have a huge Soviet hangover legacy, and then you have a revival of Islamic traditions. So when I think of Central Asia, I think of the Soviet-built circuses, I think of dachas, I think of banyas, I think of sanatoriums. They're normally man-made buildings, actually, madrasas, mosques. So the landscape's phenomenal. I mean, the deserts and the mountain landscapes are incredible. But actually, what I'm really interested in are the man-made buildings. So I wanted to choose man-made buildings, which I could then link to food and a food story and human stories around that. So mosque, for example, in Almaty, I was very lucky to be there during Ramadan, and I was invited for an iftar feast. So I write about that, and the title's mosque, and that kind of made sense. So it was a Uyghur mosque, which is particularly interesting. So yeah, that was a way of structuring the book, and it was really just because that's what I think of when I think of Central Asia. There are fantastic buildings, wedding palaces, you know, these crumbling sanatoriums, which really are on their last legs. Very, very interesting. If you like that sort of brutalist stuff, which I do. Yeah.
So I thought the mosque story was one of the best in the book, and just an absolutely fascinating glimpse. Do you want to maybe talk a little bit about that one, just so to give people an idea, just because I think it's such a great example of what you were doing in the book?
Oh, thank you. It's a really difficult essay, actually. The Uyghur, or the Uyghur, depending on how you pronounce it, story, for me, is one of the big stories which is happening around the world at the moment. Obviously, there's a cultural / genocide or cultural genocide happening of these people. And Istanbul and Almaty have two of the biggest populations. I have a friend in Almaty who's actually an American, who's married to a local girl, and he's fluent in Kazakh and Russian as well, obviously. And we went together for an afternoon in Sultan Kurgan, which is a part of Almaty with a very big Uyghur population. And we had the afternoon there, and we went to see the mosque. And when we were there, the men at the mosque were incredibly kind and told us their personal stories. There were tears. They haven't been able to reach their parents across the border in China. It was very intense. It was a beautiful mosque, big rose garden out the front. And they said, please come and feast with us tomorrow night. You're our guests. And I said, I'm not sure, you know, I'm a woman, are you sure? And they said, no, please come. So obviously I said, this is amazing, thank you very much. And we went back the next day, and they put us on the top tapchan. The tapchan is the low slung table that everybody sits around and eats together. And it was just amazing. It was 500 men and me, and women serving the food and the tea. And there was beautiful singing and recitals and storytelling. And it was a great privilege to hear these stories and to meet these people. And yeah, so that's one of the stories in the book. And I talk a bit about how their lives have been impacted. And I had to change all the names in the book, and we had to print the book in Italy. We couldn't print it in China for obvious reasons. So it's an important essay in the book. Maybe it's the most important essay.
Yeah. And I felt like it gave so much of a contrast between the beautiful buildings that the wealthy Uyghurs had built that you walk by, and then take that to the just huge numbers of people that can't get in contact with their family. I thought that was really amazing. So we actually have a question from the Q&A about Almaty. So I'm gonna take you there. So Sujata asks, what is happening to the traditional cuisine in larger cities like Almaty? I visited Almaty a couple of times, and it wasn't all that easy to find restaurants that serve traditional foods. It was definitely easier to find global generic fast food.
That's definitely true. The problem is, as well, is even in people's homes nowadays, you're much more likely to find pasta than besh barmak, which is the noodle dish often served with horse meat. Horse meat's super expensive. But I think I think the stolovayas, the canteens, sometimes serve more traditional food. But I think with Almaty, it's such a multicultural city. it's a bit like anywhere, you know, the people who live there are just as likely to eat Russian or Georgian food as they are to eat Kazakh food. And Kazakh food is quite limited. It's certain types of bread, it's certain noodle dishes, plov, but it's not, you know, it's not a huge cuisine because the nomad tradition. Dried milks, kefir, the dairy produce is something I wish that Kazakhstan would exploit more, because you have camel milk, which is interesting, but then they have the most amazing kefirs and just general milks and yogurts and ice creams, because the dairy lands there are incredible. I'm going off piste here because I also have not eaten much traditional Kazakh food in Almaty. My husband lived there for 2 years, and I could probably bet that he didn't either. There are very good Georgian restaurants, and I'm afraid we lent on those quite heavily. Yeah, it's a shame. And it's the same in Bishkek, actually. If I go out with friends in Bishkek, we go to Uzbek restaurants or Uyghur restaurants generally.
Yeah. I have so many questions that are related to like those 3 sentences that we just talked about. So I'm gonna throw questions at you here. First, Matt asks, related to Bishkek, not quite food related, but you were in Bishkek during the recent protests and violence. Has that experience changed the way that you think about Kyrgyzstan?
That's a great question. Yes, Matt, it has. It was an icebreaker into the city. There was Bishkek before the revolution, and there was Bishkek after the revolution. And I hadn't been there for that long when it happened, actually. I was renting an apartment there, and I won't bore on about this, but yeah, it was a really wild time. And it was fascinating to see how the community came together. So everything was in complete disarray. No one was in charge. The military and the police had disappeared. There wasn't widespread looting like there has been in previous revolutions. This is a revolutionary prone country. There's been 3 in 15 years. This is the most recent one. It's kind of a coup. I cannot get the difference between a revolution and a coup. It's maybe somewhere in between what's happened, but the government were overthrown. The presidential building was stormed. There were grenades, water cannons, firing. It was pretty intense. I was there by myself in the city centre. But what happened was, what was remarkable is the local Bishkekers had to protect their city from the mob who had literally been paid to come in and fight for various political factions, protect the buildings, and they had to be fed. So what I loved about this they were called the Druzhniki, literally friends. And they were being fed plov, they were being fed bread, people were donating all this food to local restaurants, which men would like barricade. And then the protesters, like the good guys, but like they'd come in, the young kids who were trying to protect the city, and be fed. And it was amazing to see food playing a role. And yeah, it was an amazing time. I was never wildly into Bishkek, to be honest. And then I've spent several weeks there, a few months just recently, and I've completely fallen in love with it. It's an amazing city. Really, really interesting. It's the people always make the place, and the women in particular. I've made some great friends recently there.
That's great. What a great question. I'm so glad that we got to.
Yeah, great question. It's fresh as well because I'm just back, so that's nice.
And so very related to that question, one of the things that I mentioned kind of at the beginning, but you talk in the prologue that part of your mission in writing this book was to capture this point in time as it's sort of on the precipice of these huge changes. So even though the book is sort of centered around a geographical place, that point in time was always a focus. Were there meals or ways of eating that you had experienced in your decade spending time there that you couldn't find, or that no longer exist, or almost no longer exist, that you felt like you couldn't include because you couldn't find them?
Yep. Certainly some of the chaikhanas have gone, the traditional tea houses, and less. There's been terrible demolition in a lot of the important cities, including Samarkand, including UNESCO listed cities. But more than that, what I noticed actually by spending this time in Bishkek recently was it used to be pretty hard work, food in Central Asia, if I'm completely honest. It was quite limited what you'd have on offer. Normally shashlik, lagman, non-bread, great fruit and vegetables in the markets, but no tourism industry other than sort of pockets of Uzbekistan and the sort of capital cities. And now, wow, in Bishkek, you can get ramen. This is a bit off topic, but for me, if you're spending a lot of time there, and there's a great Japanese restaurant called Furasatu, run by a Japanese guy making like top grade sushi. And this just wasn't possible years ago. Like, you would be on survival food for quite a lot of the time, and you'd probably get an upset stomach and food poisoning a lot of the time as well, just because the places that the locals were eating, you perhaps weren't savvy to, and you'd eaten slightly dodgy places on the side of the road which weren't that good, and it was quite hard work sometimes, much more than in India or other places I've spent a lot of time. In Central Asia, it gets pretty remote pretty quickly, and you have to eat what's on offer, otherwise you're going to be hungry. So I'd say that the infrastructure has come up so quickly that it's much easier now to travel there than it used to be for food.
Nice.
Some of the charm has gone, obviously, as a result of this, but you can't have
everything. Speaking of traditional food, one of my favorite lines in the entire book, and that I'm going to make you expand on. I know this whole time, every time you've mentioned Plov, I've been like, oh, we're going to come back to that. You say Plov is an identity. And I would love to hear more about what is the identity of Plov? What does it mean? What can you tell about a person or a country from eating their
Plov? I've spoken so much about Plov over the years. I love Plov. It's such an underrated dish. I mean, people I think now are beginning to know a bit more about it in the West. It's quite different. It's seasonal. So if quince is in season, then quince goes on.
You want to back up and just, I don't know if everybody here knows, do you want to just describe what Plov
Sorry,
is?
I should explain Plov. Okay, so
start at the beginning for people.
It's a layered rice dish. I think most people here will probably know what a pilaf is. It's not wildly different to a pilaf, although the thing with Plov is it's cooked in layers and then it's reversed. And it's normally cooked in a big thing called a kazan, which is the sort of outside cauldron. And the really important thing with Plov, which I don't tend to recreate at home, is the zerdak, which is the oil and the sort of fat and the onions, which is cooked in the cauldron first before the rice and everything goes in. So it's layered. It's normally with lamb and mutton. It's sometimes with beef. I really like the beef one. You often get a whole bulb of garlic in it. Not always. Sometimes the garlic cloves are cooked individually with the skin off, and then a really nice trick is to then mash the garlic through the rice as you're eating it. Lots of people do that. Everyone's got their own tricks with Plov and different things that they do, but that said, it's sort of always rice, obviously, carrots, onion, normally raisins. The raisins in this part of the world are amazing. They're really, really plump and really delicious. They grow grapes everywhere, and well, not everywhere, but in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. And yeah, sometimes pomegranates, not very often. Sometimes a sprinkling of herbs, not very often. The oil's quite important. Sometimes cotton oil, normally lamb fat. It's delicious. It's very oily normally. That's not seen as a bad thing. Uzbeks are prolific eaters of Plov. I think I may get this wrong. I think it's something like in a year, a family of 6 will eat a ton of rice, and most of that is Plov. You don't want to be eating it every day. It is quite heavy and quite cholesterol and quite fattening, but it's totally delicious. My favorite Plov is cooked by Imenjon Mamedov in Osh, and his Plov is normally with quince and lamb if it's in season. And the story there, can I show you a picture of him? I've just got this open because I haven't seen him and I wanted to go and see him when I was in Bishkek, but I'll go hopefully in January. That's Imenjon. So he's in his 70s and he's an Uzbek elder, 20 generations in Osh. This is the southern city of Kyrgyzstan. It's about half Uzbek, half Kyrgyz. And his Plov's epic. And it's good because he's cooked it for decades, and because he used to serve it to the mountaineers up Peak Lenin, which is a 7,000 meter peak, and he'd cook it for the best Soviet climbers who'd be going up there. So they'd sort of scale these peaks on Imenjon's Plov, which, you know, it's a great story. And he's incredibly charming. He's got a guest house, so you can also go and eat his Plov. Green Travel's the name of his company.
So I'm gonna bring you back to the original question. I mean, what is the identity of Plov, or how does it express identity?
So the Uzbeks are the masters of Plov. And I think most, I mean, not everyone's going to agree with this. The Tajiks also cook phenomenal Plov, and there are many Tajiks in Samarkand and Bukhara. They're Tajik cities. It's a lot of things. It's at festivals, it's Navruz, it's always served at a wedding. You can serve 1,000 people from a giant kazan. That might cost you, well, it used to cost like the price of a Lada car, so it would be wealthy. People who'd have these giant kazans for big events. It was traditionally cooked by men, then the Soviet Union happened and less so. Now it's cooked by whoever can cook it the best. One interesting thing was when I was in Kazakhstan on the Caspian Sea, I eaten at an amazing Azeri restaurant. So Azerbaijan's just across the Caspian. And he called it plov, not pilaf, but it was a sort of, the thing with plov is it's cooked in layers and a pilaf, not so much. I think this is the basic difference. And he cooked a plov with chestnuts, which I love, saffron, and served it with watercress. And this is his plov. So it was like Azeri flavors more. Across the Caspian Sea. So I think, you know, and I had another plov in the Fan Mountains of Tajikistan with beef and bits of lemon, because I go into detail on the lemons in Tajikistan, which are related to the Meyer lemons, which you get, I think, in America. We can't get them here. Very, very thin skin, really juice heavy, like soft skin, like a plum, totally delicious. Lemons. So lemons in plov, this was new to me as well. So everybody has their little tricks and ways of doing things. Sometimes barbaras are used, those are delicious. But it's a skill. I mean, you can tell a good plov when you get a good plov.
Yeah. What?
And it's about rice. Sorry, the rice is critical. So Imen John uses Uzgen rice, which is like a shortish grain rice that's sort of brown, and it's grown very locally to where he lives. And I think this also is critical to good plov.
Yeah.
Short grain rice.
It's one of those foods that is so expressive of exactly where someone is or is from. And so I think that it just, those tiny little details make it, you can just kind of pinpoint where on the map they come from. So I thought the Meyer lemon detail was great. They're really common here on the west coast of the US. I mean, we're coming into citrus season and looking forward to them. And so when you were talking about these amazing lemons in the book and then realizing that they're Meyer lemons, I was like, oh yeah, no, I would also be very excited to, if I had.
It was new to me. I mean, I'd never had one before. So I was just amazed. They taste like tangerines a bit. Incredible flavor. Very exotic to someone from Edinburgh. Those special lemons.
Yeah, I mean, we're here in Seattle. We're close to California, where they're everywhere, so we're used to them. But I'm sure. And
Uzbek melons. You have access to Uzbek melons.
That was going to be where I was going next, because the melons, the descriptions of melons in this book were. I was ready to get on a flight to Uzbekistan because I'm now obsessed. Will you tell me a little bit more about the melons and melon
madness? Oh, the melons are incredible. They're so incredible. You cannot get a good melon here in Britain. So they're seasonal. You have winter melons and then the rest of the melons, and the winter melons are really interesting. They're hung in melon sheds until they sweeten and sweeten and sweeten over months, and then they're sold at greater value. They've often got very wrinkly skin, so they're called the old lady melons. I actually saw some very similar ones in Istanbul recently. Turkey has great melons as well, but Uzbekistan, they've got hundreds of hectares of melon fields, and they've got crazy names for them, like Golden Eyebrow and Black Lake, and really kind of like evocative names. And the men, normally men, the vendors love these melons and will talk you through them and the different flavors and the taste. Some of them are very grainy and get you at the back of the jaw slightly. Others are so succulent and soft and sweet, like the sweetest thing, totally honeyed. And just full of goodness, and they last a very long time. So previously I heard years ago they'd be buried in the sand to mature that way before the melon sheds existed. But yeah, I mean, they're incredible, and they're very cheap to buy and to try.
I'm pretty sure melon season in Central Asia is like my new dream assignment.
It's incredible. The melons are reason enough to go. And then the pomegranates are also completely, these are pomegranate earrings, by the way. Yeah, the fruit in Central Asia is mind-blowingly good. I so struggle when I come back here. I mean, we have good apples and berries in Britain, but the fruit in Central Asia is amazing. And the sea buckthorn, which we harvest here but no one uses, they put in tea. It goes, you know, it's all kind of in cakes and jam.
As Russian and former Soviet cuisine has gotten more and more popular in North America, I've started to see some sea buckthorn popping up here.
It's a fantastic ingredient. I absolutely love it. It's delicious.
We're gonna get to sort of some of the more straightforward audience questions in a second about the book and whatnot, but I wanted to ask one more general question about the book. What was the most challenging part of capturing Central Asia in a cookbook or in a food book for you?
It's probably what to leave out. So Nowruz, the Spring Festival, for example, I probably should have gone into more detail on that, and I didn't. The sheer size of the countries makes it challenging. You can't get everywhere. The Uyghur story is incredibly difficult. There's only so much I felt I could talk about that, but it needs to be talked about. There's a lot of darkness in the book. I mean, it's a bit like with Black Sea. It's not, you know, it's a sort of, it was an adventure in understanding, trying to understand the region better, even though I sort of love it and I've known it for a long time. You can never really understand it as an outsider. So it was just really my attempt to try and understand it better. And yeah, I think, you know, trying to remain respectful the whole time and just write a book for people to wander in. And it's a difficult book. The Karlags, the sort of the gulags which existed in that part of the world were tragic and awful and claimed a lot of lives. And I go to one museum that was set up just for a gulag Karlag that was just for women and children, and there were heartbreaking stories in there, and I talk about that. Yeah, so I think you have to be honest. I didn't want to write some glossy kind of travel brochure. I wanted to just write something very honest. Yeah, that's all you can do as an outsider, I suppose.
Absolutely. All right, so I got kind of the lightning round with some pretty straightforward questions for you. First of all, if someone's getting ready to dive into your book, what ingredients should they have on hand? How do they prepare their pantry and fridge? What are sort of the staples that they should make sure to have?
Okay, it's pretty straightforward, I reckon. So in the fridge, you have to have dill, because there are lots of soups in the book, and dill for salads and soups. Good tomatoes, the best tomatoes you can have. Uzbeks always have a tomato salad, and the next thing, onion rings. So good vinegars for pickling onions. Pistachios, very, very popular. Good for going with lots of things. Sour cream, smetana, for manti, for borscht, which is very popular there still. Sesame seeds, onion seeds, nigella seeds for samsa and non bread. Good cumin seeds. There's a huge difference between the cumin seeds I can find in the supermarkets here and the ones I can find in, say, the markets of Central Asia. They're much fresher, much stronger smells.
Well, and I was going to say the same thing. So for those who don't know about smetana, it is the, I always call it the Eastern European, but I suppose Eastern European and Central Asian, Russian sour cream. And it's different than what we get in America as sour cream. And I think far more flavorful, but I don't know. I know people are here from all over, but in Seattle, we have a few sort of Eastern European markets where you can find smetana, and it makes all the difference when you're making a recipe from that part of the world. You have the real smetana.
It does. Sorry, we have the Polish shops, and I buy it from the Polish shops, and that's good. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a brand at Whole Foods, and I'm trying to remember what it is, but it's like, it says something like European style cultured sour cream or something. And so everywhere in the US, there's Whole Foods, and you can find a very Smetana-like product there. So that's my tip for folks.
Important, you're absolutely right. Oh, and quail's eggs for Plov. Often you get quail's eggs. Imen John, my friend, has all the quails in their baskets at the where he lives in his courtyard, and the eggs for the Plov. Double win. They love birds. It's the Persian tradition.
And then from the audience, we have, my husband is obsessed with traveling to Kazakhstan. I'm intrigued by the people, culture, food, and all, but also concerned about safety for Americans specifically. Obviously not right now due to the pandemic, but hopefully in the future. Any thoughts?
Totally safe on the whole. It's wonderful. I love Kazakhstan. I can't pick favorites, but I think in terms of the research trip for this book, it was my highlight because I hadn't been to a lot of the places that I go to in that book before. Yeah. The only issue you can have, especially in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, is drinking. I like a drink. You'll get that impression from the book, but vodka has seeped into society heavily, and with unemployment, and especially at the moment, cities after dark, you have to be a little bit careful just of drunk men who may see a foreigner and may, it's unusual, but it does happen, and the streets are normally unlit. I don't want to give the impression it's dangerous. It isn't. It's certainly not as dangerous as, say, London or New York. But the drinking is sometimes an issue. So if you're in a bar, you've got to just be slightly aware of what's going on around you. But the people are incredibly friendly. They love to see visitors. Kazakhstan's huge and really gets just a stupid Borat, and not very much in terms of foreign tourism. And people are really keen to show off their beautiful country. So I would say totally go. Just be aware if you get into a vodka session, it's not finished or the bottle's empty and turned over, and then the next one comes out. So this is something to prepare for, practice for.
Tiffany says, when I lived in Kazakhstan, my fellow country people generally had no idea where I was, and I never got a single person to visit me. Do you feel that the British are more in the know about the glories of Central Asia?
No, on the whole, I'm sorry to say. I don't know. No, even my dad says to people, oh, she's in a stan, I'm not sure which one she's in. I think no, there's a lot of ignorance still. I don't think it's people being, hateful and awful. I think it's just in Europe, and I can only really speak for Europe, we were maritime traders and all of that kind of colonial history. This is a giant landmass in the middle of Asia, which Russia and China know all about. And I think for us in this part of Europe, it's not really dominated our history or our headlines over the centuries. Therefore, the ignorance remains. We can only try. I was impressed with the Wall Street Journal, I have to say, for putting the recent revolution on their front page. They were the only international newspaper to put it on a front page, I think. So kudos to them.
Very nice. I'm just going to quickly answer. Someone asked, where are the Eastern European markets in Seattle? And so I'm gonna quickly respond. So I like to go to Lenny's, which is actually, it used to have an Eastern European deli inside of what's otherwise a fruit stand and sort of international market, but they still have a ton of Eastern European food. And then there's two Russian markets on Aurora. One is in the same, it's at like 135th, I think. But if you look for Chin Noodles, QIN, it's in that same complex. And I think it might just be called Russian Store. And then the other one is up near the Costco at like 200th and Aurora. And I don't remember the name of that one either. Something International Foods, but it's on the opposite side of the street of the Costco, like 3 blocks before it. Sorry.
No, amazing. I'm jealous you have access to all this stuff. I don't have.
So then the last 2 questions really are people wanting to know what you're going to do next. One person asks, you mentioned a color trilogy. Okay, because you had Black Sea, Red Sand.
Color trilogy, yeah. I'm committed.
So is the next one about mountains? And then the other question is, do you plan a book on the cuisine of Georgia, since you didn't include it in the book on Black Sea? I seem to remember there was a bit in Samarkand. So
there is some Georgia in Samarkand. I can't, and I really don't want to be about this, but I can't talk about what's happening next just because it's quite complicated, not just with the pandemic. I am working on a couple of ideas, and there will be something out within the next couple of years, but I'm not sure which is going to come first. There will be a third in the Colour trilogy.
Well, we will
Maybe
let this,
my publisher doesn't
this
even
book
know,
come
so
out.
I can't. Sorry, Naomi.
We'll maybe let this book come out and enjoy its time in the sun before we get to the next one, right?
Exactly. Now, I feel terrible for Georgia. The lovely bookshop in Tbilisi, Prosperos, is stocking loads of Black Sea, and I feel dreadful because I was never intended to circumnavigate the whole thing, and they still stock the book. So yeah, I love Georgia, but a lot of people have written great books about Georgia.
I will say, Georgia, I mean, I feel like the area that you cover, certainly in Red Sand and to some extent in Black Sea, gets much less press than Georgia.
Yeah, and I do feel that's important to cover
Yeah.
places perhaps that are less covered, but yeah.
Well, we will wrap up and we'll throw it back to Lara to say goodbye to everyone. But thank you so much, Caroline. It was great to chat.
Thank you, Naomi.
There we go. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I did want to mention, Caroline, I don't know if you noticed in the chat, one of our guests, Ataken, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, says that they are Uyghur and really appreciate you telling these stories and spreading awareness. So I just wanted to make sure that was on your radar.
I can see it now. Thank you very much. It's a very small thing, but something. Yeah.
So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Red Sands, a really wonderful book, especially right now when we can't go anywhere, to really take you to one of the parts of the world that I just can't wait to learn a whole lot more about. So thank you so much, Naomi, for doing the interview today, and Caroline for joining us from Edinburgh. Have a wonderful evening. Cheers. And thank you for joining us today. We will be posting this interview to YouTube in the next couple of days, and you'll get a follow-up email from us with that link. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a lovely evening or lovely day wherever you are. Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.